John, thank you so much for this latest story and for talking to me today.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Barry. You have the best conversations going on all the aspects of our decline, our decay, our descent into Babel. So I'm really pleased to finally be able to talk about this with you.
Okay, John, let's start with the metaphor that you used to frame the entire problem that we're here to discuss. And that's the Tower of Babel. Before we get into the metaphor of what that story represents, can you remind us what actually happens in the biblical version?
Yes, good. Let's go right to the source, because we all know, like, oh yeah, there was a tower and like God got angry and knocked it over or something like that. But if you read the story in Genesis, it's extremely short, and really all it is the descendants of Noah after the flood. They're fruitful, they multiply, they're heading out, they cross the plain of Shinar, and they decide to build a city for themselves there. And this city, they decide, will have a great tower to make a name for ourselves. It's not clear what the motivation is. Is it that they are afraid they'll be washed away again by another flood? We don't really know. But they build a city and they build a tower. And God looks down and he is offended. And he says, look what these people are doing. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. He sees humanity becoming strong and rising up. And he says, look, they are one people and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do now will be impossible for them. And here's the key line that links it to our time. He says, come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech. That's the key idea, that when I reread that, I said, oh my God, that is the metaphor. That is what has happened to us. It's not just, oh, the tower got knocked down. It's, we now cannot understand each other, and we may never again be able to understand each other.
So in the story, it's God coming down and saying, let me confuse their language. God is the one doing the confusing.
That's right.
Who's doing our confusing?
So if you trace it out, so if this is a metaphorical story of the origin of human languages, that were divided into languages, and also metaphorically just into groups, into tribes. And so much of my own work has been on tribalism, on how we evolve for intergroup conflict. But the thing about Babel is that it's not a story about tribalism or intergroup conflict. It's a story about fracturing and fragmenting. Everything gets broken up. And that means even within the teams. And that's, I think, one of the hallmarks of these last few years, is that it's not just red versus blue. It's complete confusion and conflict within the left. Also within the right, although it's more visible within the left. But it's within almost every institution, this internal contradiction, the fact that there's no governing metaphor, there's no agreed upon truth, there's no agreed upon telos or purpose. So it's that sense of confusion that I've been struggling to capture ever since Greg and I wrote our first Atlantic article on the Coddling of the American mind. It's felt like something is off with the universe, something changed. And Babel is the best metaphor I've found to capture that.
So the Tower of Babel, right, is this tale in a way about cooperation that was happening at a grand scale, God looking down at that cooperation and basically saying, and it's confusing why God would think this, but let's leave the mystical question to the side.
For someone else.
Right. When humans cooperate, nothing's impossible for them.
Right.
And that's
right.
too godlike, right? They're like gods. Our version of the tower that reached up to the heavens is modern technology, right? It's made us vastly more prosperous than our forebears. We can edit our genes. We can send rovers to Mars, and 100 million other examples that come to mind. And the idea, right, in the early days of the internet was that through the internet, we were going to overcome all of the obstacles to human cooperation. Our geographic distances, the different languages that we speak, our wildly diverse cultures and our histories, right? The interconnectedness was going to fix everything. But that's not what happened.
That's right, that's not what happened.
So tell us sort of where you place the beginning of that shift. Because it's really a shift about the way that we understood the power of the internet and how we used it.
That's right. So let me retell the story, starting with the great age of techno-optimism.
Okay.
So I'm a child of the Cold War. I first began thinking about the world in the 70s, and oh my God, the energy crisis and overpopulation and nuclear war, and everything's going to be terrible. But those of us who were sort of politically conscious at the fall of the Berlin Wall, we have to go back to that time and realize that this was the most miraculous thing. We never thought this could happen. And not only did it happen, but then liberal democracy was breaking out all over the world. And this is when Francis Fukuyama speculated that this could be the end of history, that if you just let all these countries get rich, they will follow the same path towards liberal democracy. And it wasn't just developments in Eastern Europe. It was very much the young internet and the idea that it's going to unlock cooperation, learning. Kids all over the world can learn programming, English, math, everything.
Right, like Levi's and Netscape were going to be available to everyone, and it would change the world.
That's right. And, if a country has McDonald's, they won't go to war with another country with a McDonald's until, I guess, a few months ago, a month ago. And so the 90s was this incredible age of optimism and technology, and especially the internet was a big part of it. And if you think about it in terms of the story of Babel, where we were divided into tribes and nations that were at war, and we couldn't understand each other. Well, now the greatest technology for understanding each other at a distance comes in. Not only that, but we begin to actually get artificial translation. Google Translate, an interesting little note, Google Translate becomes available on all phones by 2011. And 2011 is also the year that it begins with the Arab Spring. And so we think, oh my God, Facebook can take down dictators. What dictator could keep out the internet? And who could face down their population if they're all connected on Facebook or other apps? And that year ends with Occupy Wall Street. So people are really thinking, this is it. Like, this is the dawning of not exactly the age of Aquarius, but an age of eternal possibility and cooperation. So if you wanted to say that humanity was divided for thousands of years, but that we came pretty darn close to rebuilding the tower so that we could all be one, and not that we'd all love each other, but that we could speak of a human community. And I would say 2011 was the peak year, the pinnacle year of techno-democratic optimism. And then everything turns around.
Where does the shift begin? When you think about the early days that many of us were on these platforms, thinking about Twitter and how fun it was for people that were on early Twitter, because they were actually connecting with people, and some people found their best friends. I know someone who met their husband who slid into her DMs. I mean, there were tons of stories like that. But then as the platform grew, and as people's personas on the platform grew, the way that they used it changed. It stopped being about connecting, as you write, and it started to be about something like performing.
That's right. That's the crucial change. And so we have to really distinguish between technology, which is great, and the internet, which is great, and iPhones, which are these amazing, Swiss Army knives. All of this stuff is wonderful. I want to put all those on one side, make it clear I'm not a Luddite. I'm not saying this stuff is bad. The problem comes in with social media specifically, and not all social media. It's not bad to connect people. The bad part comes in when you get platforms that get tweaked and jiggered to enhance not just performance, but certain kinds of performance. That is what really turns everything around. And we can pinpoint the beginning of that in 2009. I wrote an article in The Atlantic in 2019 with Tobias Rose Stockwell, who's writing a book now called The Outrage Machine, going deeply into this. I'm no expert on the technology of social media. I'm just on Twitter myself. But Tobias, partnering with Tobias, I really learned a lot about the mechanics of this and the history of it. And the key to the story is that in 2009, Facebook adds the like button, and Twitter copies it. And Twitter adds the retweet button, and Facebook copies it as the share button. And so in 2008, before this stuff, Facebook and they were not particularly toxic. They were largely nice communities. You could put stuff up about what bands you liked or baby photos or whatever you want, and you could check out other people's pages. And now, Facebook and Twitter have huge amounts of information about engagement because people are clicking and clicking and clicking the like and the share button. So Facebook then implements, it begins algorithmicizing the feed for whatever creates engagement, and as we now know, research later showed, that's primarily emotional content, and especially anger. Anger is the most potent way to get people to click. So where before it was just, there was always some brand management, look at me, and these are the photos I've chosen very carefully. But those are the things you put up on your page. when it becomes about this feed, which starts as a trickle and becomes a Niagara Falls constantly, and people are just clicking, but for what? We're shaping our performance. And then what happens is, as the norms become more about not just performance, like here's what I think, but look how horrible this person is, and dumping on people and joining in pile-ons, now the cruelty comes out. And at this point, most people check out. So there's a lot of research in political science showing that most people are really turned off by the nastiness, the aggression, and the cruelty. And they just go silent. They might lurk, they might watch, but they stop posting. So what's left is the most aggressive people. And what I came to realize as I was writing the Babel Atlantic article, is that social media has not given everyone a voice. The people that it amplifies are the far left, the far right, trolls, and Russian intelligence agents. And their goal, all four of them, have the goal of attacking people, stirring up distrust. So social media really changed the connections between people and their motivations for what they're doing online. So the story that I'm telling in the article is that things really began to change in 2009 with the technology, but the tone doesn't change on the platform right away. That takes a couple years before the norms really change, and that's 2014. For some reason, 2014 is when all hell breaks loose. That's when you get Gamergate, which is the first, giant, real coordinated mob thing, and that's also when the Russians really step up their deliberate attempts to foment division and hatred on both sides by inflaming anger on both sides. That's when things begin to go crazy on campus, and that's when Greg Lukianoff comes to me and says, John, weird stuff is happening.
Just to define the weird stuff, we're talking about, total meltdowns among undergraduates at places like Yale for emails about Halloween costumes.
That's right.
We're talking about stories at places like Evergreen of professors getting hunted down with people with bats, for disagreeing about, campus racial politics.
That's right. So all of that starts in 2014, and it's just a series of anecdotes. There was an article in, I think it was Vox, I'm a liberal professor and my liberal students terrify me, something like that, about how professors at liberal arts colleges feel if they say anything, students are going to jump on them, report them, they start self-censoring. So this is when you get demands for trigger warnings, safe spaces, microaggression training, cultural appropriation for wearing a shirt from another culture, things like that. That wasn't there in 2012. Anyone who graduated from an Ivy League school in 2012 didn't see this stuff. But if you arrived in 2013 and you graduated in 2017, you had a front row seat on basically a complete cultural transformation of our elite schools.
John, I want to get a little later to the sort of generational shift that you have been paying particular attention to. But let's go back for a minute to this question of virality, which wasn't possible in the early days of Twitter and Facebook because the algorithm just wasn't there. And you explained that the possibility of virality just creates unbelievably different incentives for the user. I know, as someone who's gone viral in lots of negative ways and some positive ways, right?
Yes, right. Yeah.
So it's like what you explain is if you want to go viral on a place like Twitter for good reasons, you have much more incentive now to perform the thing that you believe your audience of other Twitterites sort of want to hear. And at the same time, you're incentivized to hide opinions that people won't like because you don't want to get piled on by the mob. Or as people on Twitter say, you don't want to be the main character of the day. Now, a lot of people hear that and say, and this was an argument I heard constantly at the New York Times, you're right, John, those incentives do exist, but they're good. And the reason they're good is because you should be hesitant to say something that's going to make people angry. And if you're worried, probably means that the thing you want to say is racist or sexist or bigoted or insensitive. Your fear essentially is grounded in something real, and the fact that you're hesitating is a good thing. Now tell me why that position, in your view, is inaccurate or wrong.
Yeah. So an interesting thing we learned from the COVID pandemic, I'd say, is that we have intuitions for an arithmetic world that fail us in an exponential world. If people were looking at the spread of the virus early on, and they're saying, it's growing slowly. But the people who understood it were freaking out. They're saying, no, you don't understand. This is going exponential, and so it's not going to be twice as much in a month. It's going to be 200 times or whatever. Exponential dynamics are very different. We all learned about R0, R0 rather, the transmissibility of a virus. If it's 1.5, it'll spread, but if it's 9, it'll spread indescribably fast. So in the same way, in the social media world, we have intuitions from the pre-Babel world, which are sort of like arithmetic, where if I say something in a classroom or in a seminar class or among my colleagues, and some people push back, well, maybe they were right to push back, and we have a discussion about it. And of course, you shouldn't say everything you think, and that might make sense in a world in which you're talking to 12 people or maybe even 30 people. But something happens when anyone can object, and that person's objection is as valid if it's 1 out of 1,000 as if it had been 1 out of 3. I used to teach at the University of Virginia, and I taught a lecture class. I taught introductory psychology, and I would really manipulate their emotions in ways to maximize their learning. And so I would lead them through uncomfortable paradoxes, uncomfortable data, and then I would try to resolve it. I took chances. And even though it was uncomfortable and maybe even upsetting for a few minutes, but then I would resolve it. And by being able to do that, I think I was a skillful teacher. Now, in a class of 300, if there were a few people who were upset for 10 minutes, that would be okay, because by the end of the lecture, it would be resolved. And even if 3 were still upset, it would be clear that what I was doing was pedagogically appropriate and I was at no risk of being fired. But things change when everyone has a smartphone and the number of the bias response team, so that they can report me while they're in class.
Wait, John, let's pause just for 1 second and give listeners a little more of a sense of your teaching background, where you've taught, and how your experiences in the classroom have changed over time.
So I taught at the University of Virginia from 1995 to 2011. I taught Psych 101. I taught a big lecture class. I was a very provocative teacher. I would use emotions and surprise and even shock at certain findings and experiments because I could trust my students and they could trust me, and we all had the shared sense that we were there to learn about psychology. There was a shared sense of what we were doing. Then I moved to NYU in 2012, and I teach at the Stern School of Business. And beginning in 2014, it wasn't like this before that, but beginning in 2014, I started getting reactions from students, either delivered to the dean or delivered on my teaching evaluations or delivered on social media or delivered to the bias response team. And anything that you say that offends any one of the 300 people in class can become a big thing that leads to an investigation. And so if you're not teaching to the average student and you're not held to a reasonable person standard, rather, the new standard is the most sensitive person. If you say anything that could offend the most sensitive person out of the 300 people in the auditorium, they have the right and they're encouraged to file a charge against you. There's a number in every bathroom telling them you can email, you can go online. Here's how you report a microaggression. Here's how you report an act of bias. So if you're offended, here's what you do. And this is why so many of us felt suddenly we couldn't take chances. We couldn't trust our students. Most of them are lovely, but unless I can trust all 300 of the students in the auditorium, it doesn't pay to take any chances, because when it happens to you, when you get investigated, we all hear the stories. Some of the committees, the one at NYU is perfectly reasonable, but some of them are not reasonable. So you never know what's going to happen to you if a student files a complaint. And therefore, it's just not worth it.
Well, this has been a phenomenon that I've been reporting on and sort of commissioning stories about in all of sort of the realms of important institutions in American life. The law, publishing houses, obviously the news business, Hollywood, medical schools. And in a way, I feel crazy because I feel like I'm doing the same story over and over and over again because it's the same story everywhere. And it seems to me that there are sort of 3 elements that have changed. One is what you just described, which is the kind of the weaponization of empathy, which is to say, even if 300 people are in the room and 299 are provoked in a positive way and challenged and got a tremendous amount from the lesson, if there's a single person that was offended, it's done for everyone. The second thing is the kind of mushrooming in many of these institutions of HR, right? Human resources, which sounds like the most anodyne thing in the world, but has actually been made into an ideological weapon. And the third thing is that the room is no longer the room. If you are in a classroom at NYU or anywhere else in the country, or a restaurant, literally anywhere, the room is the world now.
That's right.
Because everyone has a thing in their pocket that allows them to hold up a camera and make the thing rocket around the world in 1 second. And the kind of things that sources have been telling us who are in these institutions are wild. I'm thinking, for example, of Nadine Strawson, who was the first woman to head the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. She's a professor at New York Law School. And she said openly, I massively self-censor. I assume that every single thing that is said, every facial gesture, is going to be recorded and potentially disseminated to the entire world. I feel as if I'm operating in a panopticon. Another lawyer told us, I got into this job because I like to play the devil's advocate, but I can't do that anymore, he said. I have a family. There's a doctor who said to reporter Katie Herzog, in a wonderful story we ran, chilling story, he's a doctor who immigrated to the US from the former Soviet Union. And he'd said, it's back to the USSR, where you could only speak to the people you trust. People are afraid to speak honestly because they rightly fear that if they say the wrong thing, or even something that's perceived as the wrong thing, they could lose their job, they could lose their status, they could lose their reputation, and that, by the way, because of the new sort of laws of social contagion, it could hurt their entire family as well, and not just them.
Oh, right. That's exactly what has happened. But now let's return to the Babel metaphor, and let's take off from this point, because this is where I think my Atlantic essay adds something new, or at least a new way to think about that. Because the timing is exactly as you say. We, on college campuses, we were the canaries in the coal mine because Gen Z first arrived on campus in 2013. And when Greg and I wrote our article, a lot of people said, oh, come on, you're just cherry picking it's a few cases. When they go out into the real world, they can't do this anymore. They'll grow up. And we said, well, we'll see. And Gen Z began graduating from college in 2017 or 2018. And as they went out into the corporate world, and especially as they started showing up in law schools and medical schools and advertising companies and Hollywood studios, that's when everything begins to collapse in the same way. Now, of course, the election of Donald Trump complicates things because that really added fuel to the fire in late 2016. But the arrival of Gen Z in workplaces is why so many places seem to collapse in the same way over those next few years. Okay, but now here's the key. It's not that the leaders were crazy or stupid, it's that they were afraid. And the reason they were afraid is because social media, and especially Twitter more than any other platform, social media functioned effectively as if we had handed out dart guns to everybody. And so what made me think of this is there was an article in Wired a couple of years ago about the engineers who created the retweet button at Twitter. And one of them, Chris Wetherell, he said after they created the retweet button and he saw the first Twitter mobs forming, and he saw the new dynamics when you increase the virality so greatly, you get these new dynamics that are incredibly nasty and mobbish and unjust. And he said, he thought to himself, we might have just handed a 4-year-old a loaded weapon. He regretted it. He said it was a mistake. Twitter, he said, had been a nice place. And I remember when I first got on it, it was a nice platform. But when everyone has not just the possibility of going viral, but a motivation to do so, and most people don't want it. Most people don't want to shoot anybody, so they go quiet. And it's the people who like shooting people are the ones who now are amplified. But if we think of it not as a gun, because a gun kills people, if you think of it as a dart gun, where if you get shot with a dart, it would really hurt. It would really, really hurt to be shot with a dart that punctures your skin and you have to pull the dart out of your arm. That would really hurt. But what would it be like to be shot by 100 darts? So very quickly, almost as if you're a rat in a Skinner box, if you have punishment delivered, painful punishment to reputation delivered, potentially within minutes of you saying something, you get trained very, very quickly. And so this is what I've seen. I've talked to a lot of leaders in the academic world and some in the corporate world, and I've talked to journalists. They are liberals in a way that is recognizably part of the liberal tradition. But the people shooting the darts are not liberals. They are what are called in the Hidden Tribe study the progressive activists. You can say far left or far right if you want, but I think it's not just a question of how much you're on the left or how much you're on the right. It's a question of what you think you're doing. And if you're a liberal, you believe in process, you believe in due process, you believe in individual rights. But if you're an activist, and this is true on the far right as well, you think you're fighting evil, and so the ends justify the means, and if we have to destroy innocent people, it doesn't matter. So this is the new dynamic that viralized social media brought to us, is everyone is given a dart gun. Most people don't want to carry their dart guns on them, and the ones that do, basically are getting paid by the dart. The more they shoot, the more prestige they get, and we all live in fear of them. The students, I ask this over and over again, are you afraid of your professors or the other students? The answer is always the other students. You ask professors, it's always this small minority of students.